Well, that takes us to tonight's teaching, chapter 5, Learning to Live Without Lust. And the big idea that Smythe makes in the chapter is that lust, or that Greek word epithumia, is how we create a false image or persona, and that we objectify people in a need to try and fulfill our own desires for intimacy. And honestly, we can't fulfill it that way. We're called to do it differently in God and His kingdom. Now, I want to take a few minutes just to overcover a few of the key ideas in the chapter, and the two big ones that are the false narratives we encounter are the false narratives that we actually think about when it comes in terms of sexuality. And the first one is one that we kind of run into, especially I remember coming into this as I was growing up in the church or being inside of the church. There's almost this understanding that sex is bad, or it's a concession from the good, or just like, if not bad, sex is just dangerous. And the idea we find in the church is that most of the time when we talk about sex within the bounds of the church, it's always about the prohibitions, it's about the limits, it's about what you can't do. And sometimes the implication is, especially in certain branches of the church, that sex is just sinful. And I don't think we can overestimate the influence that St. Augustine had in the church. If you've ever read his Confessions, you'll know that St. Augustine, who is a thoughtful, great Christian teacher who really formed a lot of Western church doctrine, also was a man who was very perplexed and plagued by his own issues with lust and desires for sexual intimacy. He said a famous quote, and I'm probably going to get it wrong because I didn't write it down, but it was in the chapter. He says, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." And he was a person who struggled with his own issues around sexuality, and eventually he embraced the position that's predominant in the church that, it's better to be celibate than to be sexually active. And so he devoted himself to the priesthood, which was a requirement at that time. But I think his struggles with sexuality have kind of been reflected throughout church history in this idea that, if you're really all in for God, you're going to be celibate. Now, the truth is, Scripture does talk about the place of celibacy. Jesus and Paul were celibate. Jesus said that there are advantages that people who are celibate have an opportunity to serve. There are benefits to being celibate. But there's also a very clear understanding, if you look at Scripture, that sex isn't all bad. But here's that thing. Because there's this discomfort both in some branches of the church around sexuality, and also sometimes just a discomfort in the church to talk about it. How often does the topic of sex and sexuality come up within the church? Well, often around Valentine's Day when youth groups want to talk about it to tell kids not to. But aside from that, it rarely gets talked about, or rarely gets talked about comfortably. That taboo exists in the church. It makes people feel, I don't know how I should feel if I'm okay expressing myself in a healthy sexual way. The other false teaching that exists out there, though, is the one that has largely permeated our culture today, which just says, have it all, as long as it's consensual, it's good. Basically, in our culture, if two people are agreed that they want to do something together, as long as there's not a minor involved, then have at it and enjoy. And here's the thing. That view that, if two people want something, or if you want something, it's acceptable, is not entirely true, because there are sexual behaviors that do not lead to wholeness and to life. Now, both of these false narratives contain a grain of truth within them. The church's hesitation and inability to talk about sexuality sometimes is there for a reason, because there are sexual practices that bring hurt, adultery, sex outside of that covenant committed relationship does not bring the fruitfulness and joy. There's a beauty of commitment inside that the church says, there's a perimeter around this that God has created for good purpose. At the same time, the world also comes and says, yes, sex is good. And you're right, the world is right. Sex is a good gift from God. But it has to have those parameters. In fact, I think that's where, when Smythe talked about the triangle illustration that he used with his son to talk about sexuality, was really kind of helpful. If you haven't read the chapter in the book, or you just want a refresher on it, he kind of drew a triangle for his son when his son said, is it okay to kiss a girl? He says, I'm not going to answer your question, but I'm going to give you guidance. And I think that's something we need to learn as Christians. Sometimes we need to help give each other wisdom, not just hard and fast rules. And the wisdom he had was this, was that let's draw a triangle. And one side of the triangle will be physical intimacy. The other side of the triangle will be commitment. And on the bottom of the triangle, it's hard to draw it because I only have two hands. The bottom of the triangle is a new relationship where there is no commitment. It's just a brand new relationship. And what Smythe said to his son was this: as the level of commitment increases, so can also the level of physical intimacy, until you reach this apex, which is the beginning of a new phase of your journey where you've got a complete lifelong commitment in marriage, which is what Christianity would say. At that point, full sexual intimacy, intercourse, and togetherness is permissible. And here's the thing. We want to move and come to a place where we realize that sexual intimacy or physical intimacy can increase as the commitment increases. This is a really good thought. When I was younger, there was a famous book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and it was one of many of a number of different books. And there was some proposals out there from some people saying, you know what, if you're really serious about wanting to be all in with God and you want a great relationship, then you shouldn't touch the other person until you're married. You shouldn't kiss the other person until your marriage day. And to be honest, I think that was an unhealthy, out of balance thing. I actually watched a documentary by the author of that book, Joshua Harris, called I Survived, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, where he went back to kind of reflect on what the implications of that teaching were. And I think a teaching that says, you know what, someone doesn't have the ability to even hold someone's hand until they're in a very serious, fully almost married, committed relationship is a little overboard. And I held Heidi's hand and kissed her before we're married, just so you know. That said, I think we need to realize that the church has got a teaching that commitment walks hand in hand with physical intimacy, and those things grow together, and that's for the benefit of the relationship. Now, the big thrust of the chapter, though, was not just to talk about the two false narratives and to talk about that little guidance of the triangle. It was to talk about the issue that surrounds lust. Now, to talk about this section of the book, actually, I've invited someone to be with us today. If you don't know Heidi, she's an ordained pastor. She serves as a pastor here at Smythe Street Church. She also happens to be my wife, and I'm really appreciative of her and her insights. And this chapter tries to look at how lust affects men and women, and I thought it'd be just great to have her come and maybe share some thoughts. And we've talked about this at home a little bit and coming and getting ready for today. So she's going to come and join us, and I'm going to get my stool. Here, come on up, Heidi. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
All right, so here's what I think we're going to try and do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the section of the book as it pertains to men. And one of the things that James Bryant Smith does is he takes a look at Jesus' teaching about lust, which is that word epithumia, and he talks about how for men, much of the time, and I'm just going to put this out there, not all men are the same, not all women are the same. These things can apply differently depending on personality, but there are generalizations in the book, and I think sometimes those generalizations speak to what is the case for many people. But he says that for men, the issue surrounding lust is often about what you see and what you do with what you see and what you visualize. And so for men, sometimes the issue is all of a sudden when you see an attractive person, you see an attractive woman, you know, that's natural to realize that someone's attractive and say, wow, she's beautiful or whatever. But what happens is with men is sometimes we can go to a place where we'll meditate on that beauty is the way I put it. And, you know, it's that meditative, lustful look is saying, wow, what would it be like to be with or touch or whatever, and creating that lustful situation. And what you do is, in essence, when you do that, you objectify the person. You turn them from being a person into an object of satisfying my personal desire, which is a selfish act. And when we do that, that's what we need to overcome. And Jesus says, you know, you need to be willing to take radical action against that, is the starting point for men. Whereas I think he tries to make some points about epithumia in women. And I kind of wondered, when you read that, what were your thoughts on how he came at that, and your just thoughts on the whole issue for women?
Well, generally, I hesitate anytime we come around the topics of stereotypes with men or with women. It's rare that I would say that, my experience as a woman is all women's experience, and I would assume the same for men. So I hesitated a little bit there. But then when he started making connections between a woman reading a fantasy novel and a man objectifying a woman through pornography, I really struggled, and we talked about this. I was really hesitant to make that jump and that comparison there, thinking that we're not on an equal playing field with conversation here. So it wasn't until we started to really discuss the heart behind both issues, whether it's fantasy or whether it's pornography, that's when I started to get down, and I think we came up across the kitchen table with the word covet. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the key point for me, was when we start focusing on something we can't have. And with both pornography or with fantasy or whatever it might be, it's that focus on something that's even unattainable, really. And when that becomes my meditation, is the word you used, or the focus, or something that becomes all-consuming, it goes back to what we're talking about with the Ten Commandments. You have been set free. And when Jesus comes to the earth, he comes and he says, let's turn everything upside down. Let's rewire our thinking, because he's concerned about our heart even more than our actions. And so what are you coveting? And when we ask that question, that's when I started to think about conversations that I have had with women and thoughts of my own, where it's like, oh, I wish he'd love me better. And whatever better might be. Maybe better is you brought me tulips on Friday night. Maybe better is that you put the dishes away and didn't just wash them. Maybe better is legitimate. Like, maybe you love me better than someone else's husband loves them. But when our focus turns to that, it becomes this unattainable, covetous, self-serving focus. And Jesus argues that this isn't the way he wants us to live. He wants us to be free from that. He wants something better than that from us.
When I was thinking about this in terms of that, and also in terms of often with men and lust, particularly in pornography, which is an area of struggle for a number of men, I was thinking about Philippians 4:8. And I talked this over the table. It says, finally, brother and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything's excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And what really struck me is the first part of it, where it says, whatever is true. And when a man objectifies a woman, or a woman even looks, with jealousy or covetousness towards something, I think it's all covetousness, really, is what it is, desiring something that is not yours. But it's worse than that, because we start to desire something that's not even real. It's not even true. When someone looks at an image or a video or whatever, or looks at another person, or even looks at someone else's relationship, the image we construct in our minds of that is not truth. It is a fantasy.
And that would be kind of the negative side of that, but the positive side is that when I choose to focus on the truth of who you are and what you do and how you do love me, or the man of integrity that you are, and I would assume the same is for you, when you look into my eyes. I love that line he had. I left my book over there, but he said about looking in someone's eyes as opposed to looking below their eyes. I think when we start to fall in love with those aspects of each other, that's where the truth and the goodness, that's what God's trying to do inside of our hearts, to rewire our hearts towards intimacy. And I think that's actually really exciting to see what would God actually have for your intimate life? What is the gift that he wants to give you for your intimate life?
It's something to think. And the implications of that are bigger than sexuality. Obviously, I think they influence sexuality and relationship in the marriage confines, but I think of single people that, the ability to know and be known and have relationship, intimacy is more than physical stuff. It's about relationship and being known by people and serving one another, and not putting yourself first. There's that passage that is the headline for talking about relationships and marriage, which says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And it's that God calls us to that place where we're looking for the other person's interests in all arenas before each other's. Any other thoughts?
No, I think that's good. I'll be honest, this was not a subject I wanted to talk about at first, and I wondered how much it really applied personally to my life, because I think it's fair to say that, the verses Jesus was directing it to men. I think that's fair. But also as a woman growing up in the church, we learn pretty easily how to extrapolate from things that are geared towards men and apply it to our own lives. And so I actually really appreciated the challenge of getting down to the root of what was going on with that comment, and how does that actually apply to my life and to my sexuality and to my marriage.
Good stuff. Thanks, Heidi. Yeah. Yay. Glad to have you with me. Well, looking ahead to next week, I just want to talk to you and give you a little heads up about our coming spiritual practice. And the practice for this coming week is a really interesting one, another one of those ones that you'll probably want to have a conversation with the people in your world about. It is a day without words. Now, what that means is they say the goal is to not speak for a day. Now, you might need to have a piece of paper handy in case you need to communicate with someone. Ideally, it'd be great if you could give up text messaging for the day too. But the point of this is not just about whether you can be quiet, because we've talked about silence before as a spiritual practice, like being outdoors and being silent and reflecting on God's creation for 5 minutes at a time. But this practice is much about being aware of what is going on with your words and being aware of the power that words have with people around you. It ties in with next week's chapter, which is actually going to be talking about how to learn to live without lying. And sometimes we don't see how sometimes we skew our words a bit to get our way or share our perceptions. Now, if you come to me and you say, oh, Chad, it is impossible. I cannot do an entire day without speaking. Well, inside of the book, there's actually another alternative that you can use, and it's like a day of absolute honesty. And what that is now you're always supposed to be honest, and it'll make sense when you do the chapter next week. But it is to say, if you notice yourself slightly twisting the truth a bit, you immediately correct it and tell people what you've done. It's like, oh yeah, I don't care where we go for dinner, I might say. It's like, the truth is, actually, I did care where we went for dinner, I just didn't want to say it. Now, here's the thing, you might say, oh, I don't know how people react if I actually tell them what I meant inside of my heart. Often people are kind of probably more impressed that you're trying to be honest with them than being worried about, being worried about it. So I'd encourage you. It might take some boldness, it might take some thought. There's some information on pages 117 and 118 of the book. If you are going to practice a day without words, though, you might want to give people a heads up, because if suddenly you stop talking to them, they could think something's really the matter. So give a read this week. Our chapter for this week is chapter 6, Learning to Live Without Lying. I really hope that the words of Jesus and the words of the book challenge you, and I pray that you have an awesome week. God bless.